You write, what is it that gathers the diversity of individuals into the unity of a national character? For individuals, no matter how diverse they may be, all partake of a particular national character. In all these different people, there exists some hint of a national character, some coloring with which it has endowed them. Barevzez. I was born in Yerevan to a family of repatriates from the United States and France. The storytelling of this little-known modern Armenian history began with photographs, paint, interviews, and many questions. Elder repatriates were my grandparents, who made the decision for their children, the youth repatriates, my parents, to move to Soviet Armenia after World War II.
Հազարինահայր գոդրածին գործընծած ենք հայրս Մեսրոպ և մայրս Աստղան, հորեղբայրներս Բողոս, Անթո և հորեղբոր գիներ Սուլթան և Օդա, քույրս Տակոյ և Փեսաս Մանուկ Ջզմեջան և երեք քուրորտիներ, մեր հարսը Փարավոնի գինը Խանամը և աղջիկը, քերը և քերեգիններ և զավակներ։ Անոնց շադագին պիտի երկեմ ու նվակեմ 16 տարեկան հայ աղջիկիմը երկած իր գողմե կրված այդ ցավալի երկը, որ դերձորի աքսորին համար ժամանակը, որ 100 հազարավորներ ճանապարհին մեռան անոթի ծարավ գոդորվելով հազիվ միմաց հասան դերձոր եւ այսօր կան ապրողներ իրենց հայտնը գործընծված։
On my third visit to Armenia, since leaving it as a child in 1965, I lived for over a month on the 4th floor of a flat in a Soviet-era building on Tumanyan Street, not too far from the Opera House. To me, writing to Vasily is writing the letters where the thoughts to be expressed are at times disjointed, at times too full of detail or scant in memory. In 2016, I held my art and ethnographic exhibition on the Great Repatriation at the Armenian Center for Contemporary Experimental Art in Yerevan, the same year that I learned of a recently published English translation of an Armenian sketchbook written by the Russian novelist of life and fate Vasily Grossman. Arriving late during the fall of 1961, to assist in the Russian translation of Hratia Kochar's The Children of the Large House, Vasily joined the company of other fine Russian writers to visit the Caucasus and leave to later generations their travel sketches. There was Alexander Pushkin's Journey to Erzurum and Osip Mandelstam's Journey to Armenia. And published in 1962 is Vasily Grossman's travel experiences of the people and the villages during his brief time in Armenia. Also in 2016, I walked around with my camera along the old streets, much less traversed by the locals and tourists. One day I veered toward an area called Gond, still impoverished, still with the same aura of Soviet times. Here was one of the living areas assigned to the post-WWII repatriates. It was the area of low, flat-roofed structures with small rectangular openings and passageways that Vasily mentions in his journal. And from the stories that I heard from the surviving repatriates, there were no glass inserts or doors within these crude framed openings. To me, writing to Vasily is writing the letters where the thoughts to be expressed are at times disjointed, at times too full of detail or scant in memory. As he writes his stories in an Armenian sketchbook, I find threads of relational experiences between his time in Armenia and the lived experience of the Repatriates. To Vasily's eventful life of observation and commentary in an Armenian sketchbook, I respond with imagined letters retold to someone who lived in the country, albeit briefly, but at the cusp of the first repatriate emigrations. These letters are replies to Vasily's narrative. They give further life to the raw images found in the photographs I scanned during my research and presentation years, interviewing surviving repatriates from France, United States, Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, and Greece from the years 2010 to 2015. Barevdzez Vasily. As I was reading an Armenian sketchbook this morning, I underlined the passage where you describe the country of Armenia as you traveled by train. It is quite profound, and clearly, from the repatriates' perspective, its poetry cries a portent to the life ahead for them. You write, "Flat deposits of stone, fields of stone. A mountain has died. Its skeleton had been scattered over the ground. Time had aged the mountain. Time had killed the mountain. And here lay the mountain's bones." Not only is this a literal reading of the place sometimes referred to as Karastan, land of stone, but for the repatriate story, it is metaphoric. One of the most chilling memories shared by many of the repatriates who I interviewed is about witnessing extreme poverty and desperation by the people living in Batumi. This is where the repatriates arrived initially by ship, before their final train ride to Yerevan. His life and that of my family's presence in Armenia overlap by only a few years, and his death comes only months before the exit visas, limited in time to be used, were issued to my family. Barevdzez Vasily. The distress for many repatriates began before they arrived in Yerevan. The seriousness of their situation was apparent as they approached the port city of Batumi in Soviet Georgia. It was here where reality greeted the surreal. The ominous setting instantly set many newcomers aback. While still on the ship, just prior to landing in Batumi, the repatriates were told several times by officials to throw all their food into the water before leaving the ship. They were told that the command was a precautionary measure to quarantine the country from disease. Some repatriates had brought with them preserved foods, citrus, bread, sliced meats and cheese to eat along their travels and to have a supply with them when in Armenia. Many followed the orders and tossed their food into the water. Others tried to eat what they could and passed it along to the other repatriates for consumption so as not to waste good food. In my interview with Mari, a young repatriate from Lebanon, she said that there was so much food floating in the harbor that day that the poverty-stricken locals swam into the water to retrieve what they could. It was an astonishing sight for the repatriates. They were not communist sympathizers nor did they belong to any Armenian political organization. Rather, their motivation was an impassioned, non-political vision of their Hayrenik. My father, who was barely 18 at the time, followed the orders of the family patriarch. Outside the ship, away from the crowd, the roads leading to the dock were burning with the whizzing tires of constantly shuttling taxis, automobiles, and loaded trucks, disgorging their human and physical cargoes and hastening back for fresh loads. The taxis and the automobiles were racing to make the deadline, for fear that repatriates would miss the ship. Others were carrying relatives, friends, or acquaintances, some of them to kiss those departing a fond farewell, others tearfully begging them not to take this disastrous step. Most of the well-wishers, however, were either rabid communists or Soviet sympathizers. On deck, there was a general atmosphere of jubilation and merrymaking, although overcast with a somber shroud of the impending parting. Groups congregated in corners, congratulating one another, indulging in lively conversation, dancing and singing. There were the final parting scenes, with fond and affectionate kisses, with request for letters from the fatherland upon their arrival. There were secret codes agreed upon, with which the repatriates would tell their relatives in America how they were enjoying life in Armenia. Communist hawkers of the repatriation made fortunes in the black market, fattening themselves on the spoils of the poor returnees who had sold their homes, their farms, and their personal effects for a song in their haste to return to the fatherland. The 162 repatriates were originally going to sail late in 1948 on the Pobeda, the ship that was instrumental in the repatriation of Armenians from France, Lebanon, Egypt, Palestine. However, in September of 1948, a fire damaged the ship, the cause of which was unknown. 2 weeks after the event occurred, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin laid acrimonious blame upon the Americans, consequently affecting Soviet regulation to completely and immediately desist the further repatriation of Armenians from the diaspora. An exception was made less than a month later, where in the end, the 162 American Armenians became the last group to repatriate. Now I'm in the throes of my Yerevan repatriation exhibition. The link here between my thoughts is Gond, which was one of the housing locations where the repatriates were taken as part of their resettlement accommodations. I remember reading an interesting passage from your book where you describe the houses as large gray stone rectangles. I visited Gond nearly 70 years after my mother's family was trucked to the location. What I saw of the place in an independent Armenia of the 21st century most likely held better attributes to what was experienced by the repatriates. Nevertheless, it remained what we would call squalor. Let me explain. The day I walked into the area called Gond, one of the oldest quarters in the western boundaries of Yerevan, an old woman offered me coffee as I asked her questions and talked about my project.
Արի գնանք ուտենք։
Dear Vasily, maybe this is a good time to clarify a little bit about the American Armenians. There were two caravans, the first in 1947 and the second in January 1949, which was delayed from a voyage scheduled in the fall of 1948. There was some news coverage about the first event. Image and text storytelling aims to redirect our understanding of the Great Repatriation by not only weaving, but by including the imagined, lived, and documented, because they are the mantle of human drama. Let the tension, contradictions, speculations, and emotive information all come to light, so that somewhere in the morass lies the events of the story. One day, as I ventured to the area with my camera, I acquainted myself with an old woman who was living in one of the houses up the hill off Saryan Street. As with most of the Armenians I met during my trips to Yerevan, I was invited for coffee. She explained to me that she had no running water, so she carried buckets of water up old, high-incline wooden stairs that were conceivably constructed in the 1950s. Refusing my help with the water, I decided to ask her for permission to videotape our time together as I explained my project to her. She agreed. One of the best images that I took of our time together was a view from her home onto the city center below. I've enclosed it for you. I'm thinking of creating a painting from the image. She was quite hospitable, and I listened to her talk about life in present-day Armenia, including the newest of the diasporan Armenians, the Syrian Armenians, as this was the life of post-2012 and the Syrian civil war. Sadly, I cannot recall her name, but I am determined to find her again the next time I visit and share printed copies of the images that I took of our impromptu time together.
Ինչ եղած է?
Ասում եմ իմ համար էր եղեք ոնդը։
Before I forget to tell you about my mother's family experience in Gond, I'd like to address your remarks about the appearances of many of the peasants. You mentioned in your book that the peasants were wearing the uniform of all Soviet working folk, thick, dark-colored weighted jackets. The color of stone were the colors of their scarves, and the texture of their skin was the texture of the earth. Can you imagine that it was not too different in such terms of appearance as to what the Repatriates saw in the people of Yerevan in the 1940s? With that, The local people of Yerevan may have been equally stunned with the appearance of the repatriates. That is, their grooming, no beards, and clothing attire included fedora hats, sunglasses, suits, and hand gloves. Of course, what I described to you are the repatriates from Egypt, France, the United States, Iran, Lebanon. This information comes from them and the images that I collected. The dichotomy was still felt among the locals and repatriates from not too affluent of places, such as Greece as well. When arriving in Yerevan, some were given underground shelters as homes. Others were taken to newly constructed apartments where plastered walls were still damp. Sometimes an entire repatriate family would be assigned to one room. Electricity and gas availability was limited, so many of the appliances brought into the country by the repatriates went unused, and in many cases they were forced to sell them on the black market. Some who rented space in the household of locals had to pay additional rubles as papach for the privilege of having a decent roof over their head, while others had to move from place to place until government housing was available or limited government loans were available to build a house. An Armenian Sketchbook by Vasily Grossman. Page 23. Linking all the balconies and verandas, like arteries and nerve fibers, are hundreds of long lines on which the copious and motley linen of the inhabitants of Yerevan has been hung out to dry. Page 23. The inner yard. What constitutes the kernel, the heart and soul of Yerevan is not its churches or government buildings, not its railway stations, not its theater or its concert hall, nor its 3-story palace of a department store. No, what constitutes the soul of Yerevan are its inner courtyards. Vasily Grossman. Barevzes Vasily. This letter is difficult for me to write. Even though much of what I write here happened over 80 years ago, and despite having presented this information in print and lecture format many times, the experiences that were described to me first by the repatriates who were confronted with the Soviet secret police, and later found in official documents housed in the National Archives of Armenia, represent the darkness of times committed by the darkness of humanity. In June 1949, less than 3 years upon the Great Nedkacht, half of the tens of thousands arrested were repatriates. One could wake up in the morning and find an entire neighboring family gone, picked up in the middle of the night. It happened to the Filyans, Alexander Filyan, father of Crosby, the boy with the camera. The Repatriates were not the only victims of Stalin's regime. Educated local Armenians felt his political paranoia as well. Cattle car loads of Armenians were sent to exile to Siberia during the dark early hours of the morning. The last of the deportations of Armenians, who the Soviets had labeled as hostile or as socially foreign elements, ended in the early 1950s. A number of repatriates ended up in exile, even before the organized deportations. Some of these repatriates were genocide survivors. And it was always in the middle of the night when the modus operandi of the Soviet secret police took place. Before the Night of Terror in June 1949, the Repatriates experienced the power of the Soviet secret police, not much after arriving to Soviet Armenia. On January 21, 1949, the date of the second caravan of American Armenians, Alexander Khachikfilian took the voyage to Soviet Armenia with his wife Araksi and two boys, Crosby and Jack. The family arrived on February 25, 1949. Then, on the evening of March 11, 1949, in Soviet Armenia, Alexander, a repatriate from New York, was arrested by the NKVD in his family's apartment, in the presence of his wife and two young boys. 15-year-old Crosby remembers the uniformed men announcing his father's arrest, and his mother crying and saying, "Is this what we came to Armenia for?" To this question I ask, what was the Armenia of the Repatriates? In a daze himself, Crosby now became the head male guardian of his 7-year-old brother and his distraught mother. The next morning, Crosby found money on the floor. His father had somehow managed to take it out of his pockets undetected before his arrest. When asked about this story, Crosby says that he still remembers the amount of money left behind, 700 rubles, an amount of money that would not be enough to sustain the family for the length of time that his father would be gone. And so it began, the selling of personal and household belongings. Once again, the Soviet secret police was successful in instilling fear as a way to control the populace. The remarkably tragic story of Harry Carlebian shortly began after his family's arrival. Once he realized his mistake of uprooting his American wife and children from their middle-class home in the United States, Harry took action to reverse the repatriation process, but it resulted in his imprisonment, torture, and later exile. All this in response to Harry's efforts to contact someone at the American embassy in Moscow. He pleaded with the officials that it was not his family's decision to repatriate, therefore they should not be forced to stay, yet he, as an Armenian, would stay. After several attempts to correct the situation, Harry was able to hand a letter to a staff member of the American embassy who was taking a break outside of the building. Not long after, the Soviet secret police arrested him at his house. For nearly a year, he spent time in a Yerevan prison where his family came by to bring him food and other items without ever having an opportunity to see him. One day, when the family was paying a regular visit, they were told that he had been tried by a court and was found guilty of being a traitor. So in March 1949, Harry Carlebian from Detroit, Michigan, 3 months after arriving in Soviet Armenia, was sent to Irkutsk in Siberia to serve a sentence of 15 years. This was the Armenia of the Repatriates. Nothing was ever found in the National Archives on Harry Carlebian. This could mean a number of things, among which could be his name, the spelling of which in Armenian did not register with official records, or that his official records were located elsewhere, perhaps in Moscow. However, at the National Archives, I was able to gain limited access to secret police records generated by the forerunners of the KGB. I was able to find records on Alexander and another American Armenian who had been exiled in the 1940s, Alice Haiganush Papazian. After I returned to the United States from one of my trips to Yerevan, I sent copies of the MGB documents on Alexander to Crosby, who, after leaving Soviet Armenia, ended up in Paris in the mid-1970s, and there he stayed with his family, Susie, his wife, and his 2 children, Armen and Rosie. Among the papers that I sent to Crosby was his father's prolonged interrogation documents, which were first transcribed by hand in Armenian, then typed in Russian. Crosby agreed to translate the files for me from the more legible Russian into English. I plan to film him reading his translations the next time I stop in Paris. As for Alice Papazian, I wrote the following as an excerpt to be used in one of my presentations, or maybe for the exhibition. She was accused of being an enemy of the state and exiled to Siberia in 1950. The MGB confiscated the possession of her technology: the Chevrolet Auto, radios, sound recording equipment. This is what she brought to Armenia. Her name was Alice Papazian. She was born in 1902 in Keheg. Keheg is a province near Erzurum. Historical circumstances made her a New Yorker. Then in 1947, she repatriated with her husband to the Hayrenik. As with the other repatriates, she quickly became disillusioned, but unlike the others, she did not keep quiet about what she saw and what she experienced. In 1950, she was arrested by the Soviet secret police and interrogated for months. Accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda, she was sentenced into exile. She served 6 years until she was released after the death of Stalin. Dear Vasily, how I look forward to writing more letters. One of these letters will tell you the story of me in Devine, the little girl and the apricots, coming back to an independent Armenia 38 years later. Sincerely, Hazel.
В июне 1953 года восстали рабочие Восточного Берлина. Радиостанция «Свобода» в своем новогоднем обзоре так описывала это восстание.
17 июня в Восточном Берлине на строительстве зданий на аллее имени Сталина рабочие, узнавшие о сокращении их заработной платы, бросили работу и двинулись к правительственным зданиям на Лейпцигерштрассе. Вскоре у зданий министерств собралась 20-тысячная толпа, которая пела старую революционную песню. правительства Гретеволя и Ульбрихта. Мы требуем свободы. Появились на грузовиках наряды так называемой народной полиции. Их появление еще больше разъярило толпу. Демонстранты начали бросать камни в окна министерств.
Идея монолита не может допустить расхождений. В Берлине с Бранденбургских ворот сорвано красное знамя. Но восстание восточно-германского пролетариата задавлено советскими танками. В Москве в то же время продолжается процесс консолидации власти. Армейские части окружают Москву. Убийством Лаврентия Берия наносится удар всесильным органам госбезопасности. В Корее
Передаем радиорепортаж, который был сделан за день до смерти Сталина в связи с сообщениями советского правительства о тяжелой болезни диктатора. Советское радио и печать сообщают о якобы безграничной скорби народной в связи с печальной судьбой генералиссимуса и тирана Сталина. Наш корреспондент обратился к бывшим советским гражданам, проживающим на Западе, с просьбой поделиться своими мыслями по поводу неожиданной развязки, наступившей в карьере красного диктатора. Плоть от плоти, кровь от крови своего народа, бывшие советские рабочие, колхозники, стахановцы и интеллигенты делятся сегодня с нашими советскими радиослушателями своими думами и переживаниями.
Мы только что сообщили проживающему в Нюрнберге в Западной Германии, бывшему мастеру сборочного цеха Сталинградского тракторного завода, о последних радиосообщениях из Москвы. Передаем ему слово.
Я бывший мастер Сталинградского тракторного завода, а потом бесправный концлагерник Советского Союза, недавно выбравшийся из сталинского рая, где я прожил как беспартийный большевик десятки лет и очень хорошо знаю эту страшную антинародную систему полицейской власти. Сталинская эпоха погубила десятки миллионов народов в России, боровшихся за свободу, за демократию. Я считаю себя представителем народа в России, находящихся сейчас на свободе. По-моему, наша задача, задача всех антикоммунистов, усилить свою борьбу против советского режима, потому что народы Советского Союза жаждут своего освобождения от советской тирании. Я хочу и буду принимать участие в свержении большевистской диктатуры.
Мы продолжаем радиорепортаж, который был сделан за день до смерти Сталина. Вы слушаете выступления бывших советских рабочих, колхозников, стахановцев и представителей интеллигенции.
Мы пришли навестить бывшую заслуженную учительницу РСФСР Валентину Семеновну, которая находится на пути к выздоровлению после только что перенесенного воспаления легких. Здесь лежит она на больничной койке, в чужой больнице, в чужой стране, куда вынудил ее убежать сталинский террор, несмотря на ее заслуги перед народом. Она уже может говорить, и мы охотно передадим в ее руки наш микрофон.
Дорогие друзья, вчера совершенно случайно врач больницы принес мне немецкую газету, в которой написано о тяжелой болезни Сталина. Это очень много значит для нас, для всех находящихся в эмиграции. Болезнь Сталина. Много раз было в газетах о болезни Сталина. Может быть, наконец, это будет действительно последняя его болезнь. Я еще лежу в постели. Как христианка и как женщина я не должна желать кому-нибудь смерти. Но я думаю, не только я, а все миллионы женщин Советского Союза желают этой смерти. Я учила детей. Я учила так, как нам говорил наркомпрос. И очень часто в моей душе и в моей совести пробуждалось слово «нет». Нет что дает советская власть, что заставляют вкладывать в головы детей. Смерть Сталина, я думаю, будет большой радостной вестью для нас. Смерть человека всегда оплакивается, но смерть Сталина, я думаю, мы должны и обязаны встретить с торжеством, ибо тысячи, миллионы русских людей, и не только русских, но и других национальностей, было погублено именем Сталина. Мне очень трудно говорить сейчас, потому что я еще даже не встаю с кровати, но я хочу, я надеюсь, что наконец вместе с ним погибнет этот режим, который задавил русский народ, залил кровью всю Россию.
Мы от всего сердца пожелали Валентине Семеновне окончательного выздоровления и тут же посетили бывшего советского работника искусств, режиссера Бориса Давнева. Передаем ему микрофон.
Дорогие соотечественники, скоро безжизненное тело красного деспота вынесут за пределы векового Кремля, поставят под конвой почетно караула и обяжут трудовую подсоветскую Москву принести клятву у гроба тирана на верность его разбойничьим подвигам и заветам. Но мы твердо убеждены, что каждый честно мыслящий человек, подходя к черному одру диктатора, подумает про себя: как жаль, что ты умер естественной смертью. Твои дела достойны эшафота. Мне, как старому труженику театра, до слез обидно за трагическую судьбу исторически прославленной русской сцены. На моих глазах беспощадно умерщвлялась ее жизнеутверждающая сила, и вместо ее насаждался театр провокационного социалистического реализма. Люди, которые смело пытались протестовать против хулиганствующего произвола советской пропаганды в русском театре, с вульгарной жестокостью отстранялись от руководящих постов и предавались физическому уничтожению в окровавленных подвалах НКВД. Жертвами так называемого социалистического реализма в театре пали такие люди, как директор Большого оперного театра Арканов, художественный руководитель Малого театра Рядов, директор Московского художественного театра Амаглобель, директор и художественный руководитель колонного зала Михаил Бочков, режиссер Коршевского театра Карпов, председатель комитета по делам искусств Платон Михайлович Керженцев, его заместитель Боярский и много других, которые составляли цвет ведущей художественной мысли в центре русской столицы. Вот почему я, как русский артист, ненавижу Сталина как диктатора и не жалею его как человека.
Мы продолжаем радиорепортаж, который был сделан за день до смерти Сталина. Вы слушаете выступления бывших советских рабочих, колхозников, стахановцев и представителей интеллигенции.
Передаем слово бывшему председателю колхоза имени газета «Правда» Большемурашкинского района Горьковской области.
Вчерашний день я услышал сообщение о великой для меня радости. Я представляю себе, такую же радость переживают мои бывшие колхозники. Но не свою радость высказать или выразить, как я, не могут. На смертном одре лежит любимый. Через ее имя, по чьей указке, столько пролито слез и народной крови. Сталина постиг удар. Сама судьба наказала его за все. Сталин разул, раздел, закабалил наше крестьянство. По его указке колхозники остались без коров, хотя он и обещал, говоря: уж мы, большевики, постараемся, чтобы у каждого колхозника было по корове. А на самом деле на 15 дворов одна коза. Товарищи колхозники и рабочие Советского Союза, нанесла удар судьба Сталину, а мы должны нанести удар сталинизму. Мы не должны дать твердо засесть в сталинское кресло еще одному тирану.
Наш микрофон в редакции русской антикоммунистической коммунистической газеты. Бывший капитан-лейтенант советского флота, ныне сотрудник газеты, пожелал сказать несколько слов, которые он обращает к советским морякам. Передаем ему микрофон.
Сталин умер или накануне смерти. Миллионы россиян с радостью встретят смерть деспота вместе с политбюро тиранящего народы России. Балтийцы, черноморцы, моряки Тихоокеанского и Северного флотов, матросы, офицеры, штурманы, артиллеристы, рулевые, не забывайте, всегда помните лучшие традиции русского флота. Те традиции, которые Сталин и его клика 35 лет хотят из вас вытравить, но не могут вытравить. Русские моряки были всегда с народом и на страже интересов народа. Были они с народом в феврале 17 года, когда народ выступил за учреждение в России